Good evening and welcome to the Senior Synth Stream. Today it's about computers, small computers in synthesizers and effects. Small computers like Raspberry Pi and Teensy and ESP32, etc. As usual, it will not be 100% technical because most of our guests, all of our guests understands it, so it's okay. Well, before we start and before I introduce the guest, I have to say I was so close to cancel the show, but because of the good guest, I decided that the show must go on. It's because I had a surgery Thursday, and it was going well. It hurts a lot. Really a lot. So today was planned to be a day of rest, as tomorrow. But then my mom fell on the street today, so I had to come running and help her and bring her to the hospital and all that. She broke her shoulder and overarm, but just a small fracture. So having the arm fixed will be enough for a period. She also had a big cut in I don't know what you call that part right there. I can put the others on. The chin? Yeah. Isn't this the chin?
Well, that would be more cheek.
Okay. Then the chin. Yeah. So she had a big hole in the chin, and it had to be stitched. And her teeth survived because she has an underlip. So it needed a few stitches too. But besides that, she's doing well, and I have to help her with taking on her socks and things like that, mornings and evenings and all that stuff. So I was nearly canceling the show, but I decided not to. Well, let's put all the guests on. These are the guests for today. It's Ken Flux Pierce. I don't think he's representing his company today. He's just here. Yeah.
I'm always representing the company just because I'm a fan of our own products. So
yeah. Me too. But I'm not hired.
I'm here on my own accord.
Yeah.
We're all fans of those products, so.
Yeah. And that's ASM, of course. Then we have Floyd Steinberg, or Alex. I will try to use the Floyd name because nobody knows who I'm asking things when I say Alex. So welcome, Floyd.
Hi.
I usually ask people how their week has been. I forgot that with Ken, so we take Ken after Floyd. Floyd, how has your week been?
Oh yeah, it's been quite the week. Not as bad as yours was. Obviously, I hope you're getting well soon. But all kind of things happened with the kids and the car, and I was busy all the time.
Yeah. And Ken, how has your week been?
It's been pretty well. It's been very busy and just, life. So everybody's healthy, and that's kind of the main thing as what you were saying, So, I'm wishing your mother a speedy recovery and yourself as well.
Thanks. And Andy, synth addict?
Yes, hey.
How has your week been?
Pretty standard. Not much to report. Just keeping busy and drilling over stuff I can't afford. All the usual stuff. So, but happy to be here. Sorry to hear about that, Henrik. I knew you were having the surgery thing. But sorry to hear about your mom too. That's not good.
Yeah.
So
She's okay. But I'm not. It hurts like hell, and I have to visit
to keep doing the show. So.
Yeah, I will be off a few times. About every half an hour, I have to get out there. So,
wow. Most people get like a paper cut and they go, "I can't do the show." So
Yeah, yeah. But it only hurts when I'm out there, so it's
that's
okay.
true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, thanks for doing it. So, good to be here.
yeah. Good to see you. And Dan, you are usually a Cork guy.
I am.
Yeah. How has your week been?
It's been pretty good. I'm wrapping up, going on a bit of a trip, so getting a lot of stuff done. But yeah.
Any news from Cork? As usual, you can't say a thing.
Yeah, well, nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing upcoming. We did just ship a plugin, so that was a big deal for us. But,
Yeah. Ken just asked in the private chat if I could turn him up. I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. Dan, we have had you on earlier, but please tell what you do at Cork, what you released.
well, we just released Multi-Poly Native, and so that's kind of part of our digital synths series with the wave state and the mod wave, and so that was our latest thing. Bring the third one into the in the box domain. So that's a fun project.
Yeah. Were you on the what was it called? The OP6. It was not your project, right?
Project not from our group. It's kind of based on the same platform, but it was from a group in Japan.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great guys too.
Yeah. Okay. Now everyone is presented, and then we have to talk about all the chatters. Welcome, chatters. Welcome to I Sing the Body Electric, Kostu Kai, Wagoo, boom, 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 boom. And they write a lot. Andy is there, Ken Spong is there, and Ken Flux, of course, Matt Brown, TJ Trackerjack, and that's about who's on or who has written something in the chat for the moment. So welcome to you. It will be a good show, I hope. It's good people we have here. So shall we start talking Raspberry Pi? Because we can all talk about that, I think.
Sure.
Oh, it's quiet.
I mean, if you want to talk about it in terms of synthesis, or we could just talk about like retro gaming.
That's important too.
Dan, are many of the people over at Core just opening these things up and using them for arcade machines as well?
I don't believe so. No.
Yeah, I didn't.
Do not believe so.
That's really the move, though. Is, if you can do both, then that's added functionality that we all enjoy.
I should add some ports.
If there's enough space in the firmware, some companies do include a game.
That's true.
Look, even the 1010 Bitbox can play Doom, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Ken, if you start, then we'll take it from your level. What yeah, just.
Well, I mean, I'll start the discussion off like this. I think that there's a big misconception in the music community when I see people discussing processing inside of synthesizers and groove boxes and that sort of thing, where first off, there's always been a lot of buzzwords in this industry, right? Like buzzwords have been just like the marketing guys love that stuff. And I think that there's been this kind of long-standing thing where it's like people kind of know just enough to not know anything, but think that they know everything. So, and I will be the first person to tell you, there is so much I don't know. I am not a developer. I'm not an engineer. I do work closely with them, but I'm smart enough to say, hey, look, clearly, listen, I didn't even graduate past algebra, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you your job. But no, I think that there's been a long misunderstanding of how processing works in synthesizers. What makes a powerful processor for a synthesizer versus what makes just a general powerful processor for a computer and that sort of thing. How the processes differ as far as like the order of processing, that sort of thing, DSP. Uh, but also, I see there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to like terms like FPGA and fixed gate array processors, and as well as just hard coded DSP chips, and then things like the Raspberry Pi and Linux platforms and system on chips and that sort of thing. So I think it's worth noting to people. A lot of the times I'll see people deride something that's like maybe a Raspberry Pi or like a system on a chip, which relatively speaking is new. There have been older products that have done this. I mean, you can go back to, I think it was what, Oasis was. How long ago was that? That had to have been,
Oasis was released in 2005, and there was the Hartman Neuron
yeah, like
also.
20 years ago. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like it's not that the idea is crazy new, but the accessibility and availability and the number of external manufacturers creating these sorts of devices now that can then be used by music equipment manufacturers is greatly increasing. And I think that a lot of people get stuck on the idea of like something like a Raspberry Pi when you compare it to say an iPad or an M1 chip or something, and they're like, "Oh, well that's not powerful at all." It's like, "Yeah, but compare that to just about any processor that's in a synthesizer today. It's extremely powerful. And it can do a ton of work that previously was unobtainable." I see a lot of comments where people are like, "Oh, well this isn't like a custom chipset designed by XYZ company." And it's like, yeah, but at some point you have to realize that like that might not be the most cost effective way to get the highest amount of processing for your product.
Mhm.
Um, so I just kind of like to speak about that elephant in the room, and I think Dan could probably speak a little bit more eloquently to that point.
I don't know about eloquently, but it's. I mean, one thing I find. I mean, there's several things, right? One is the idea that whether something is an ASIC or a DSP or an FPGA matters to the sound, and that to me is a pretty silly argument because it's all math, and we've been doing. Uh, we've been doing DSP-based synthesis since no, sorry, 1991 or so. Um, in fact, when I joined in 1990, that was one of the things we were working on. It was kind of an early precursor to Oasis. Um, so the idea that you've got numbers floating around and being multiplied and added together, and that it really doesn't matter what hardware is doing that math is an important thing. Some things do matter, like being able to work in floating point versus fixed point makes things a lot nicer. And DSPs took a long time to catch up with that. I just expanded to be very large, which is disconcerting to me. I'm not sure why. But anyway, I can't see anyone else now. Henrik, is that on purpose?
You are the star of the show.
Someone who's not used to this. So anyway, so one thing is just that it really matters where the idea that it doesn't really matter where you're doing your math. The types of math do vary a little bit, and in general, we're kind of in favor of floating point for a long time now. And another thing is that I think that if you have an ASIC or an FPGA or a DSP or a custom chip or an array of analog chips, it's pretty hard for people to know how much that costs. Whereas a Raspberry Pi, they have this idea, oh, well, a Raspberry Pi is a cheap computer, so something based on a Raspberry Pi has to be cheap. And I'm not going to go in and name names because I don't think this is important either. But the Raspberry Pi is actually much more expensive than a number of analog synthesizers that I know of. If you just look at the part that's making the sound, right? It's a lot of this stuff is really surprisingly cheap, and that's why people use ASICs and FPGAs and DSPs is, for cost effectiveness, for your, per megaflop. That's not to say that some analog synths aren't expensive. They absolutely are. But I know of analog synths that cost I don't know, a tenth the amount of money that a Raspberry Pi costs. So the idea that it's cheap is also false, I think. And I don't know, it's for us, for our group, we started off doing arrays of DSPs, first with the original Oasis that never shipped, and then with Oasis PCI, it was an array of 5 Motorola DSPs. And it's kind of a drag, really, to deal with arrays of DSPs, because you have to really manage what's on the DSPs, and sharing memory is difficult or impossible. And there were a number of products that came out that were based on that idea. So Pro Tools would be the most popular one, but you also have Creamware and TC making mass market products that were arrays of DSPs, because that was the only way you could get enough processing power to get anything done. But you have to really worry about how the DSPs are talking to each other, and how they're accessing memory. And so the idea with the Oasis that shipped, and Kronos, and all of these new Raspberry Pi synths, is that you get this kind of megalithic DSP, and it happens to be a mass market thing, which can be used for other stuff like running Windows or Linux. But it's really good at crunching numbers. Vector processing is really good at crunching parallel sets of processes. And so these are really very useful, at least to our style of working with these things. They're very, very useful as very powerful, massive floating point DSPs. So that's kind of how we've thought of them. And Raspberry Pi it's an awesome company, and I can't really speak to their motivations very much, but I mean they come from this background of having a foundation, and of really wanting to make computers accessible to everyone. And so one of the things about that is that they're very cost effective. The solutions are very cost effective. And so it's a beautiful thing for us. And if you look at other ARMs, they tend to not offer the amount of bang for buck that Raspberry Pi does. So that's why we like using it. If something else comes along, we're not religiously wed to it, but they're a nice company to work with, and their products really kick ass. They really do.
There's some limitations as far as their pricing structure, though, isn't there? As far as like, I don't, I haven't looked at it recently, but I know that there was like certain limitations as far as like how bulk ordering is done, and I believe that there's like a bare minimum amount that or a price point that has to be hit with it, that maybe what's the word I'm looking for, like off-brand ones might not have. I'm not so sure about that.
Possible. I mean, I'm pausing a little bit, because I am not sure how much of what I know about this is public and what is not.
Yeah,
But
I hadn't looked into it a while ago, but yeah, me bringing that up comes from a public place, just to just to be
Yeah.
clear about that.
Yeah. And so I guess what I would say is they don't, at least as far as I know, they don't do much in the way of quantity discounts. So it's really not the same as buying other chips. They are strongly motivated to protect hobbyists. Although, the piece that we use, the compute module, it's a little bit less suited to hobbyists, unless the hobbyist is also buying a main board that will host the CM4, because the CM4 isn't, it just has, it's like a DIMM format module. So it doesn't, you can't plug it into anything directly. You have to have a main board that it plugs into. And so we make a main board that it plugs into, and that has audio I/O and MIDI and that sort of thing. And so that's less of a hobbyist piece, but in general, they work very hard to limit markups on their products also. So I will say that during COVID, they were very much affected by the inavailability of the Broadcom chip. So it was very difficult to get them for some time, and that's why we ended up doing the Mark IIs with the CM4 as opposed to the CM3. We just couldn't get the old one, and it happened that they had a new one that had about twice the processing power for about the same price. So it worked out okay, but it was a long time that we couldn't make anything. And again, I can't get too specific about that, but it was a long time.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits / dangers of having like a processing unit that can be used by so many other products outside of our specific industry is, yeah, when supply chain issues hit, you know, a car manufacturer or somebody is going to have way more pull than a synthesizer manufacturer. Like
Right.
I think there's still a massive misconception as far as how large the music technology sector of
Yes.
musical instruments is. Like
Yeah.
you could talk about the size of saxophones, for instance, versus synthesizers, and generally speaking, saxophones are a way bigger market than even, you know, synthesizers. And I think that the perception is very different because there's so many more technology centered people
Hmm.
in music tech.
Hmm.
So social media wise and that sort of thing, of course, you're going to see a lot of that in your face a lot more. But the size of the actual industry is really small. And even if you look at like top sales figures and whatnot from companies all around the industry, when you add all that stuff together and look at it, it's like go look at how many sales a toaster makes,
Right.
and you'll be like, oh,
Right.
okay, that's why, you know, a processor that's way less powerful than an iPad can cost so much more in a product like this. You know, that cost of scale.
Right. Well, and yeah, so in general, the markups in our industry are much greater, which is why you see some companies like DigiDesign, for instance, making products that, you know, you're designed to slot an iPad into, because it's so much more. It's so much less expensive to the consumer, so much more cost effective to the consumer to just buy their own iPad and stick the thing in than it would be for DigiDesign to do that. I mean, forget about trying to make that iPad, because that would also be very expensive. But, you know, even just buying the iPad, you would have to charge a whole lot more for it.
Yeah, and there's the chips and the processes behind those and all of that. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, when you're at such a smaller scale, everything just shoots way more expensive.
Yeah.
And then you add on to that, you know, if you're dealing with a much smaller market size, you're also there's not always the same sort of libraries and background things already built in place for you to use. So when I speak about libraries, you know, oftentimes a product is not the first product in that sector, right? So
Mhm.
if you're doing something like a refrigerator that has the ability to talk to Wi-Fi and deliver you some information, there's a whole infrastructure behind that, you know, where, you know, the developers can kind of pull upon code that's already been written and look at these things. Whereas in the music industry, yes, there are music libraries for code, but I would argue that the development of that stuff is far more niche and specific than a lot of other products that are out there. So because of that, you have smaller companies having to do more uplift to kind of create some of these products, and that just increases cost even further. You know.
Yeah, we don't use much in the way of standard libraries for audio processing. Um, I mean, Juice for graphics is pretty awesome. Although, you know, whenever you're using anyone's library, you're limited to what they want to do with it. Um, but yeah, I think that you were saying something before that, you know, people overestimate the size and importance of the industry, and I certainly see people overestimating the size of my company, and especially my group within my company. You know, we're very tiny. um, you know, and especially when you compare us to any consumer electronics company, right? Uh, so yeah, I there is a limit to how much we can do at one time, and you know, we have to choose our battles and choose our products very carefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you describe how wave state or poly can't remember the name. Okay, can you describe how it's built hardware wise? Is it how much processing is happening in the Pi, and how much is happening on external boards?
Well, so if you open the thing up, what you'll see is that there are two boards for the front panel, and each of those has a microprocessor on it, very small one, and that's used to scan the buttons and knobs and write to the screen for one of them. And then there's another processor that scans the keyboard, so it watches the keyboard and figures out what notes you're playing and what velocities and release velocities you have, right? So there's those three processors, and then there's the Raspberry Pi, and the Raspberry Pi is doing everything that you hear. So all of the synthesis, all of the effects are happening on the Raspberry Pi, and it is a 4-core chip. And if you were to look carefully at the way that polyphony is allocated, you would see that we're using 3 of the cores for synthesis and 1 of the cores for effects. And that sort of thing is, I'm not going to say it's necessary, but it's helpful because you get to sum the 3 synthesis chips into the effects and not have to send things back and forth very much. Because again, even talking between cores, you have a little bit of delay, so you want to minimize that. So yeah, I mean that's the basic thing. It's very similar to the Atom chip that we used in the Kronos and the Pentium that we used in Oasis. We weren't doing multi-core stuff with it. It was just a single core at the time. But by the time we moved to the Atom, which again, right, a very, very inexpensive chip by Intel standards, but very, very powerful from the perspective of someone trying to do DSP. So I don't, yeah, I don't know. There's definitely overhead to it. There is definitely the requirement to work with buffers as opposed to in DSP land where you're doing everything in single samples, or most things in single samples depending on how you're approaching it. But again, for us they work pretty well. Ken, I actually don't know what kind of processing is used inside the Hydrasynth. I don't know if you guys are using ASICs.
No one knows. It's
No one
actually
knows.
it's actually a gerbil inside of a little wheel.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
We use dubia roaches.
It's just pure alchemy. Yeah.
No, it's actually their own. It's a chip developed by Modeli. So it's their own DSP chip. But it is not. It's not something like a system on a chip platform, like a compute module or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Dan, I'm glad you brought up the Atom because a lot of people laughed at it as a computer processor in general because it was kind of considered weak. But NI's Machina Plus has quad-core Atom and it works quite well. So it can be good in the right circumstances.
Yeah, well, I mean, we brought out the Kronos. It did, 140 voices, 100 was okay. So sorry, I have to go back and see. This is a long time ago, and my group doesn't work on the Kronos or Nautilus lines anymore. But I mean, with the SGX1, for instance, it did 100 quad voices.
Wow.
On that Atom, and that was far, far more than we were getting from our dedicated ASICs at the time.
I think
so you can do a lot.
I think one thing that would be interesting to talk about is whenever people notice, oh, there's a Raspberry Pi in that, then the next question is, why is that thing so expensive? And most laymen don't really know about the enormous time that research and development takes in these machines. So if we have a chance to talk about that.
Well, again, Ken could also speak to this, I think, but the processing in a synth is only part of what makes it expensive, right? Ken was referring earlier to markups, and I won't get specific about our products, but in general, you see about 3.5 to 5x markups from parts cost and non-recoverable engineering costs in our market. And with Apple, I don't know what Apple's at, 1.5 maybe. And Apple is thought of as a company that charges a big premium on their products, right? So, and this is throughout the market. This isn't just Korg. So anytime you see a price, and if the Raspberry Pi in there costs $35 or $50, you have to multiply that by 3.5 to 5, and that's what that part costs. And the reality is that with, at least with some synths, the sound processing is only a small portion of what it actually costs to make. And I'm just talking about hardware here. I'm not talking about NREs, except perhaps molding NRE. But knobs, buttons, LEDs, cases, power supplies, all of these things cost money. And so, our goal actually with this particular line was to bring things in that sounded awesome, that didn't skimp on the audio processing or the D to A and that sort of thing, but that otherwise were as cost effective as possible. And that was our goal really with the wave state and the mod wave and the op6 in particular. Multi-poly is a little bit fancier in terms of its construction and wood end panels and that sort of thing, and I think it looks really, really nice. But anyway, so when I was talking earlier about analog synths with, in some cases, audio processing hardware that was much, much less expensive, in some cases you spend a lot of money on other stuff. And it's not to say that that's bad, right? I have some guitars on my walls here. They're all black. But something about picking up an instrument, whether it's a guitar or a synthesizer or a saxophone or drums. I've got drums behind me here. There's something about the physical aspect of the instrument that I think is a very real thing in terms of inspiring the instrument and inspiring the musician and making it a fun thing to do, a fun interaction to have. And that's what most people, I think, are interested in with an instrument. So, again, with our stuff, we tried to kind of balance the things we thought musicians would be touching and would care about, with things that weren't as important. But and I think everyone does that. I don't know. I guess I'm uncomfortable. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that these are expensive instruments. And maybe it's because I grew up buying synthesizers that were really much more expensive than these, and then making with Korg synthesizers, which were almost orders of magnitude more expensive. So to me, these are very cost effective. But again, I think that most of that is about two things. One of them is about underestimating how much the Raspberry Pi actually costs in comparison to other processing that's used in synths, and the other one is understanding that there's a lot in there other than the processor that adds to the cost. That was me trying to be short.
Perhaps we should also talk about what we can use these things for as a private person. Like I have a weather station here I've made with a small Raspberry Pi.
Cool.
So that's you, Floyd, who should bring those that side of the SBCs forward.
Well, yeah, I think I have the hobbyist perspective of this, running a YouTube channel. It's I don't know why this happened, but somehow I kind of slipped into this topic, and I think these Raspberry Pis are great enablers for people who are technically inclined to build and also musically knowledgeable. And when I look at the statistics of my YouTube channel, I can see that there's a certain age group of people that are interested in these devices. And I think the fascinating thing is you can pick these up, and there are a lot of libraries and tutorials on the internet, and you have an idea of, I could do this and that, and you can nowadays you can just go to ChatGPT or Copilot and ask for a specific piece of code, and it will give it to you, and it kind of works. And by applying that code and seeing, this kind of works, but not really, I have to fix this and this. Yeah, it's really a good opportunity to get into developing your own devices and music instruments. And yeah, that's really fascinating. And we've seen a number of great projects emerge from this homebrew scene. Like, I think the Dirty Wave M8 came about like this. And stuff like, I don't know, the micro decks here. These are all fun. And I think we will see more small companies entering the market with projects that started as an open source project and then got professionalized in some kind of way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I have a Pi which is running home automation. So whenever my wife is sitting in the living room and I sit here, and she switches off the telly, then it turns off a lamp that bothers her when she goes to bed. But at the same time, another lamp is getting red, so I know she's on her way. so they can be used for many things, not only music or weather stations or such. But there are also other processors like Teensy. What makes the Teensy different? Can anyone explain that?
Yeah, I mean, there's Teensy, and then there's like the Daisy platform as well, and these are kind of platforms that are designed to be kind of lightweight, easy to develop for. Should be low cost of entry to get into, and also as I was kind of speaking before about libraries, some of these already have some audio libraries out there. So, like, kind of basic things like if you need a basic audio filter or something like that, these kinds of building blocks can already be in place to make it a little bit easier for a developer. Now, I want to stress, I am not a developer. I don't code. The most coding that I did was like on Commodore 64 when I was a kid in like BASIC and stuff. So,
Cool.
but no, but I know enough people, and I work enough closely with them to kind of like grasp ideas here and there, and understand what they're dealing with. So when I suggest things, I don't sound like a moron as much as I normally would. But that being said, yeah, like there's so you have these new smaller platforms that will run very low power too is the other key. The fact that you can run these things in very efficient low power situations, which means you can place it into something like a Eurorack solution where it's important to note that most Eurorack power supplies, I mean, you're talking about maybe 1.5 amps in them, per power module if you're doing like a switching power supply thing or that sort of thing. So if you start loading those up with computers that are drawing a lot of power, like for instance, I have a Push 3 here, which again is amazingly efficient for what it is, but that amount of processing power is a far bigger power draw than something like a Teensy or a Daisy or whatever. So yeah, I think that stuff is really interesting in the operating systems that they function on.
Well, and this is another good point, right? That again, despite people's impressions of the Raspberry Pi, it can do a lot, and so you just don't need all of that for doing a single effect, for instance, or even a multi effect, or a small synthesizer. You can get away with a lot less processing power than that. And as you say, I mean, one of the weaknesses of this platform, actually, the CM4, is that it's not really well suited to battery power, for instance. And so it'd be nice to, like they make they make other products like the Pi Zero, which are much lower power. But yeah, the Moore's law has kind of cooled down for Intel, right? But it's still very much there for ARM, and so these things are they're doubling in processing power every couple of years, and in the case of Raspberry Pi, actually, they got again derailed a bit, but the 3 is 3 to 4 was about a 2x doubling, and 4 to 5 is again about a 2x or more doubling, depending on what you're doing. It's amazing. It is just amazing what ARM cores are doing now. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for small, very power efficient, very inexpensive devices, depending on what you want to do. And yeah, the idea of like little Euro modules or guitar pedals, it's very exciting what's going to be available.
I threw some links in our chat here just so you guys can see them. I'm not sure if you
Sure.
guys are familiar with things like Elk Audio
Yeah.
OS, and and then there's also like Electro Distro, which when I was mentioning the Daisy, that's kind of where that comes in from my side of knowledge on it. But yeah, it's cool that there's also been. I feel like, at least from my perception, there's been an up ramp of audio being used in these platforms now, which is kind of overcoming some of the early issues that I was seeing. I know that some of the early Pi modules, or Pi Eurorack modules and instruments that I was seeing, they were dealing with like high or inconsistent latency. And that was kind of a challenge. And now you're starting to see that stuff is getting sussed out to where you're getting very low latency on Pi platforms and these sorts of platforms, which is really interesting. That's something that I think, as musicians, we're hyper aware of latency when it comes to the feel of instruments, and especially if it's something percussive based. I mean, then you really notice it. Because maybe you're doing stuff. Maybe you're one of those crazy guys in Berlin who's rocking 180 beats per minute and then doing 30-second notes on top of that. That's a really short amount of time to process and to be able to feel something. And if you are syncing multiple devices across that and you're dealing with other jitter coming from other places, your latency better be dead on, right? So I think that the movement as far as audio companies getting a hold of making the latency stable and low latency has been really interesting lately. Dan, would you say that that was any kind of a challenge to you guys, or did you feel like you already had that sorted out before you came to the project of working with that stuff?
Well, both for the Oasis and when we moved to the Raspberry Pi platform, that was part of the initial development process. Was, can we deliver a reasonable latency on this platform? And in both cases, there was skepticism, but ultimately, our solution here is much less exotic than with Oasis, right? Oasis was actually running as a kernel module, which had all sorts of, it had advantages at the time, but also a bunch of disadvantages in terms of maintenance and things. So,
Oasis was Linux, wasn't it?
yes, Oasis was
Yeah.
running in Linux, but
Yeah.
the synthesizer was not running as a user application. It was running as a kernel module. And that kind of blocked you from a lot of it, blocked you from debugging and that sort of thing. But it allowed you to basically make it so everything that was not a kernel module in Linux was running as a process and was significantly less lower priority than our synth. And so that meant, I mean, the one of the things about a synth, right, is all this stuff isn't really real time. Real time is sort of an illusion of large objects, and so you just have to be kind of fast enough. So a DSP often is real time. It's like sample comes in, sample goes out, and if anything goes wrong there, you're hosed. And again, there are DSPs that do things in buffers, but with with anything running in a CPU, you have to, there's latency everywhere. There's latency pulling from memory. Even if it's cache, there's still latency. And if it's not cache, there's significant latency. If you're having to stream from disk, there's latency there. If you're having to get audio in through a driver and then out through a driver, there's latency there. So there's latency kind of everywhere. So you really can't do things or rather, it's a big challenge to do things in hard real time, is what we refer to it. So buffers allow you to not worry about that as much. And you have a buffer so that, if sometime you don't get the data that you need, then you have a little bit of time to catch up. Or if something, one of the things that we can do in these systems that we couldn't do in DSPs is have things that are intermittently expensive. And so again, you get one voice that is really expensive briefly and then comes back again. And because you have buffers and because other stuff is kind of yielding, you have a little bit of space to play with. So this is why, things appear to get more expensive when you run with a lower buffer size. In general, they're not actually more expensive. It's just that you are seeing now every little burst that was being covered by the larger buffer size. And if it can't keep up, then having a small buffer size gives you much less headroom to keep up. If you are running something that's low latency, one of the things you would have to be concerned with is making sure that it's not bursty. Ken, you've been very good about issuing multiple. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired right now, and when I'm tired, I find it hard to find words.
I have ADD, so I'm just gonna be throwing things all over the place.
Awesome, but you've been very good at stating that you're not an engineer. I am absolutely not an engineer, but again, I've been hanging around them for a long time, and so I sometimes play one on television, I guess. Basically. Anything that I take really should be taken with a grain of salt.
I remember when I got my Op 6, and you guys did some amazing stuff with the efficiency of that code, because I've built stuff with Raspberry Pi 2, Pi 3, and stuff like that using Raspbian and creating like a kind of a computer interface and doing web browsing. Man, that thing was slow. But whatever you guys did to optimize the code, it runs so amazingly well on the Pi that's in there. So I was really happy with that. People like to complain, why is it a Raspberry Pi and why does it cost so much? But you guys put so much work, obviously, to make it work so well and sound so good. So damn those idiots that aren't just naysayers,
Yeah, well, I think that the thing is that you look at the polyphony of these devices, you look at what they can do. I don't think there's anything to apologize for about the cost.
Yeah.
And again, we really, especially with the wave state, our goal, what we really wanted to do was to make a mini log. So we looked at the mini log and we said, what can we do if we do a digital version of this and kind of take because that's all of our expertise is with digital synthesis and the cool things that it can do. So, taking that as a guide, what can we do? And, we made some different decisions about a lot of things. Minilog's a fantastic and very successful instrument. But the goal really was to make it inexpensive. Like, what can we do that's really, really cool that still won't break the bank? Because we'd been working on other things which really had kind of been bank breaking things, which is also fun to work on. But doing something different there. So as far as efficiency, I don't know how much I can talk about that, but I can say that we're really pretty efficient, and we also kind of spend a lot on certain things. People are certainly seeing that with some of our plugins, like the 2600 and the multi-poly, which are not overly cheap from a CPU processing power. But again, the multi-poly, we run that on a CM4. So.
I got a question about that series of devices that, if it's overstepping, just say shh. But no, so you guys went from you had like the mod wave, and then you went like mod wave MK2, and same with the wave state. Was that just because of availability of the processors, and you were like, okay,
Yes.
we have a more powerful platform, and that's what's available now, so just moving to that, or was there another reasoning behind it?
It was exactly that. We simply could not get Compute Module 3s. They were unobtainium. And I would say how long, but I'm concerned that that might be proprietary. But I think if you look back, you can see that they really weren't available for over a year. I could say
Yeah,
that.
and I think around that same, like, it's funny because yeah, it will hit that specific, like pies and whatnot, but also it was hitting so many other chips and so many other parts for so long. I mean, shoot, I have a and I'm gonna butcher how it's pronounced. I don't know how it's pronounced. I've even talked to Roman and I still don't know how it's pronounced, but I have a Isanine being built, or
Okay.
Ice 9, or however you want to pronounce that thing.
Okay.
And I didn't have time to personally build it, so I had a good friend, who's building it. But I sourced all the parts, and I can tell you this was around that same time, and getting a hold of some of these parts, especially processors, was wild. I'm talking processors went from being maybe $10 a chip at a consumer level. This is not, bulk because it's just me, but from like maybe $10 to $20, which was even kind of high at that point, to literally $250 a chip, which is like, what are you talking about? So getting a hold of these parts was yeah, it was absolutely insane. So I can fully understand that, and when I saw the MK2 come out, I kind of had figured that that's what was going on, but at the same time, it's like, well, that's a good thing. Like this is what's good about that style platform, right? Is
Oh, yeah.
that the portability of the code into a new processor. So it's like as processors grow in power, it's like that this code doesn't have to be completely rewashed and changed and all this. It's like, yeah, there might be some changes that need to be made, but it's not, the development isn't going to be as insane. And one would hope and kind of extrapolate from that like if a flagship came down the road, that maybe if you have really powerful processors and whatnot, then you can implement these synthesizers as nodes inside of something even bigger, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of good things about this sort of development for the music tech industry, in my opinion.
I really think so. I mean, you were talking about places where we're not able to leverage the mass market. This is a place where we can leverage the mass market, right? And we're a very small part of this market. So the much larger market is essentially helping to pay for the research and development of these parts for us, and I think that's fun. I mean, DSPs, right? The big push for DSPs has always been kind of either expensive hard real-time environments or cell phones, something cheap. And cell phones are now all ARM, right? So the ARM chips are different, but the cores are the same. The SoC elements, the system on chip elements that surround the core may be different, but the cores themselves are the same. And people do things with memory access, and so I I'm not meaning at all to say that there isn't unique IP in individual ARM processors, but um, it's really neat to see the world as a whole moving towards this, and what can happen when that occurs. And we'll see. I'm sure that Moore's law will slow down with ARMs as well. But right now, yeah, it's a very exciting time. And so with the Mark IIs, you were asking, like, so we couldn't get CM3s. CM4s, they eventually offered a CM4 that was designed to be pin compatible with the CM3, but in general, CM4 was designed differently. So you had to remake your motherboard, and you had to reduce some driver stuff that was not insignificant, but wasn't horrible. And then you have a processor which is 2 times as fast. And so the question is, what do you do with that? And I will tell you that there was some push to simply have the same spec, so we didn't confuse people, and not call it a Mark II, but just say, hey, we can ship these things again. But that really seemed like a waste to me. And so we were able to double the polyphony of the mod wave. And yeah, I think it was I definitely think that it was confusing. I think that there wasn't great communication about that ahead of time.
That's also one of those things where I think it can be sketchy as far as like whether marketing even wants to talk about that kind of stuff, and they don't know, like, well, do we want to talk about this or not? And then yeah, so messaging can get weird. So I get that. I did think it was funny because it was like the polyphony is something mad right now. What is it on these devices now? It's like what, 64 voices or something?
The wave state, and again, this is kind of a power and cooling thing, but the wave state SE is actually 120 voices.
Good lord.
And that's stereo, by the way. But of course, they're wave sequences. So if you use wave sequences, you're using two at a time. So it goes back down to 60 stereo voices again. With the wow, I really should have this on the tip of my tongue, and I don't.
But yeah, like 60 stereo voices. Like the point being is it's like, well, how many voices do I need? It's
yeah.
So it's a pretty impressive amount of voices. I mean, like I have like I'm sitting here playing the Omega 8 over here earlier, and I'm like, these 8 voices are like, I'm happy. So, but that's kind of where we get into interesting questions of like, well, how the processing works and stacks up of like, okay, well, like what can we do complexity and quality wise versus polyphony wise, and these are different trade-offs that can happen. But also when you're dealing with something that powerful, it's like, yeah, if you, I don't know if you guys are like oversampling in there or like or other processes that can kind of hit your CPU hard. But at some point, it's like you have to make a choice of like, okay, well, like I think our audio quality is well enough that let's just dump it into voices at this point, that kind of thing.
Well, I think so. The wave state, for instance, and the mod wave for its sample playback use. It's so tempting to talk about proprietary stuff, and I just don't know what we've exactly talked about. But I'll say that it's a very high quality interpolation, significantly higher than you normally find. So on the Kronos, for example, we use the same one in the HD1. And if you're transposing stuff, it really makes a difference. It's nice. With the multi-poly, we introduced kind of system-wide oversampling. And so it's always running at 2x. And hi, Scott. It's always running at 2x, and then it is running at 4x kind of optionally. In most cases, it doesn't make an audible difference because of the various other things that we're doing to anti-alias and stuff. But with wave shapers in particular, it's useful to do that. So
yeah, I would assume,
and with the multi-poly, the polyphony is lower.
Yeah, I would assume when you get into things like wave shaping and like wave folding, for instance, and FM, that's when that sort of stuff really kind of comes into play, because then maybe if you're oversampling or not oversampling and you have some FM, you get these really, really high harmonics. It can happen really fast. So yeah, that stuff can get important, but it's always interesting how these sorts of processes are handled in different synthesizers, because it all kind of comes down to the character of the synthesizer. Like I like to think about the digital synths of different eras as like, these have really interesting character too. When people talk about vintage analog and they're like, oh, well, this filter and this VCA sounds like this, and the noise floor of the MS-20 is like this, and you've got all these different characteristics in an analog that are almost always celebrated, right? Even when they're problems, right? Like let's be real, like some of these vintage synthesizers had a lot of issues with them, and that's why they became vintage synthesizers and not still produce synthesizers, right? And newer models came along and different techniques were used to figure things out. And then you have modern analogs, there was definitely an era of modern analogs where things became too clean and too perfect and people didn't like it compared to the old ones. And, why does a DCO sound like this versus a VCO? And, you had all these little quirks in there, character wise. And I go back and I look at stuff like I love the old Novation stuff, some of the old Novation digital stuff. And there's quirks in there. There's glitches. There's aliasing both low and high, and there's different things in there. I love a synthesizer that people hate, and that is the Red Sound Dark Star. Right?
Okay.
People hate that synthesizer, and I fully understand why. And the reasons most people hate that synthesizer are exactly why I love it. Right?
I have a Dark Star too. Yeah.
Yeah, like there are. There are ways that different synthesizers over the years, digital synthesizers I'm talking about now, would start to compensate for aliasing or other artifacts, band limiting, for instance, just different ways of rolling things off in different ways. And growing up in an era where digital synthesizers is like part of my youth, right? Like I grew up literally, I learned how to read and write on Commodore computers. Alphabet Zoo on old Commodore computers is how I learned. So this is like ingrained in my soul, is like the sound of an NES or the sound of a SID chip, that kind of thing. And there's like all these like the pitch didn't track perfectly and you would get these aliasing things. And so my ears kind of perk up when I hear certain things like that. Whereas that's still kind of, in the industry, we still kind of strive to like get perfect, right? But I also like the mindset of like looking at the analog stuff that was done, and it was like lessons were learned there of when we got too perfect. It was like, oh wait, there's beauty in the flaws, right? And so I tend to kind of like, if a digital synth isn't perfect, if maybe like you have a virus, for instance, the virus actually has quite a bit of aliasing in certain areas, right? But that's also a sound that if you don't have that and you try to recreate it, people who are ingrained in that style of music that became popular with it will be like, yeah, no, that sounds wrong. Like that's not it, And it's the same with like a CS80. If you try to recreate a CS80 with like a perfect modern synth, a lot of the people who grew up listening to Vangelis will be like, yeah, it doesn't sound quite right, even though it should sound there. It's those inconsistencies and things that are interesting. So I like kind of exploring the different flaws of digital and not necessarily shying away from them all the time.
It's I do these comedic Christmas songs. Since I'm a nice Jewish boy from Southern California, it's a long-standing tradition among nice Jewish boys from Southern California to do Christmas songs. And so a couple years ago, I did Running Up That Hill. And that was a very interesting thing. And it was interesting kind of looking at the various breakdowns and videos and what people got right and what they didn't. And also one of the issues with that is that Kate Bush, who's one of my idols, is pretty closed-lipped about her processes, and in some cases was working just by herself in the studio, so that you can't even interview engineers about what happened. Like, we don't know. We left for a couple days, we came back, and she had this. In this case, there's more that's been talked about, but there's this sound that actually apparently was substituted for a different sound, the main lick. And it's actually not even just the main lick. It's most of the song is this one cello sample, right? And it's one sample. It's not a multi-sample. And it's doing the chords and it's doing the melody up high. And I went back and read stuff about what people were saying about the Fairlight when it came out. And what people loved about it was that you would do this. You would put in one sound and stretch it across the whole keyboard. And it did really crazy stuff. And it absolutely did not sound like a cello, except right around the place where it was sampled, right? And that was, and the guys who did the Fairlight actually felt bad about this. They really didn't want to be just reproducing something. They wanted to make something new. But they started showing it to people, and people said, "Oh yeah, well, I mean, it is cool that I can play it right here and it sounds like a cello, but it's also really cool when I play it like 3 octaves up and it's this weird chirpy thing."
That's why T2 sounds so good by Brad Fidel, because all that stretching and aliasing and stuff. Yeah. So.
My very first synth in Sonic Mirage, exact same way, and they just let the aliasing shine through as part of the sound.
I have a Emax like right next to my head right here, an original Emax, and yeah, that's like one of my favorite things. One of the first things I did with it was I sampled. I have a Rhodes back here, and I sampled the Rhodes in, and it's just like, yeah, I set it to like 6K, and then I sample the Rhodes in, and it's the further you get away from that root of the sample, the better it sounds, because it's just, it rounds everything off in these weird aliasing ways, and like it gets darker as you drop down in pitch from it, and it's just, yeah, oh, I love that stuff.
Dan, I know we were talking about the common code base and the capabilities of all your CM based synths. I'm pretty sure you can't say, but does that not also mean that you can take a common framework for your Windows or your Mac to run your native versions on top and share that same code base? Because I'm sure you're not doing that from scratch. You got to be reusing code.
Right. Yes, we are. So, you know, there's a common code base. There's a platform. We do talk about that. There's a software platform that all these instruments are based on, and that platform can cross compile for ARM and for Mac Intel and Mac ARM and Windows Intel. It's not so the synthesis aspects of things are all the same. The UI is clearly different, and because of that, some other things end up being different. But yeah, that's what we're going for, is to be able to have, you know, a platform and be able to deliver it in multiple places in the same way as
I'm
seamlessly
so
possible.
blown away by the multi-poly.
Thank
I
you.
absolutely love that platform. It's so inspiring. And I have to apologize to the watchers. I was not planning on doing this today, so my studio is all covered up. In fact, I had a bit of a heart attack. We went online, it put me up on the screen, and I suddenly realized, oh my God, is there something back here I'm not allowed to show? I'm like, make sure everything's covered up.
But it's okay, Scott. People heard some time ago you were quitting, so I think.
Yeah.
I think it's okay.
Hey, Scott, what are you not allowed to show? What do you got going on back there?
Not gonna get that out of me.
No.
There's good things coming. I can say that.
Poke, poke, prod, prod.
I'm used to that. When I worked at Apple, I had to walk through the hallway with stuff covered in black shrouds because my neighbors couldn't even know what I had based on NDAs and stuff. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I have unreleased underwear right now, so you know I'm keeping that off screen.
When you talk about releasing an underwear, I don't know if I want to go there. So yeah.
I had a core question for Dan. So
Okay.
when you get guys like companies like Mutable Instruments making the MIDI PAL, or Daedalus making the Daedalus, these cool little Arduino-based like tools or synths, or different combinations of audio processing, and even Google has the NSynth. So has Korg considered making more small, simple products like that for either tweaking stuff with the MIDI functionality or audio or a synth or whatever, instead of making the bigger keyboards? Have they considered doing something almost like a Volca but more around Arduino or something like that, and going down the line?
So I guess I was going to say we make Volcas, but what do you think of this as a distinction? Tell me more.
Just something using mainly my main point was using something as cheap as an Arduino as a core. I don't know what's in the Volca, but it's.
Arduinos are designed for UI and kind of physical control, aren't they? Rather than as a processing platform.
I've heard different things. I mean, Daedalus is built around Arduino, so, and it's pretty wicked.
It can vary.
I
mean, I have
what's in there?
Some Eurorack modules that are Arduino, like very early. Early to me, like we're talking 2012 type stuff. That was like very low power Arduino. But again, it's to your point, it is kind of like control stuff, and there are some processing things done like that. But yeah, like I've got some really, really low power processors that are all just digital modules in my Eurorack. So there's some wacky stuff out there that you can do.
Yeah, and as Scott was showing, I mean, I think that's an M. Sorry, was that
it's the original NTS one.
Yeah. So I think that is an M4, an ARM M4. You could
I
open
seem
up.
to remember. I remember when I put it together because you got to build these things. That I seem to remember it was an ARM chip.
Yeah.
I'm still blown away by what this thing can do, especially the effects. The reverb on this is really. I use this as an outboard reverb.
Cool.
Just as an insert.
Yeah, those third-party reverbs on there are crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here is one of the this right here. I don't know how well you're gonna be. I doubt I can go up here and have it focus because my camera is just a mirrorless and it's not gonna autofocus. But anyway, this is the Daisy that is on the back. This is a Modbap modular Hue module. But just to give an instance of how small and efficient these things can be, I mean that's pretty cool. And this. This module is doing multiple effects. You're doing filter, drive, tape saturation, and then lo-fi, which is, sample rate reduction and bit depth, as well as some noise and a few other things going on in there.
I didn't know that. Are Corey stuff based on Daisy? Are they?
Yeah, this is on Daisy. Yeah.
All of his stuff is Daisy?
I don't want to say that all of it is Daisy, but yeah, I would say Daisy is the primary platform behind it. Which, if you go to like Electro Distro, you can see like they're. I put the link in the chat earlier, but yeah, that's kind of how that development stuff started, and yeah, very very cool. I mean, they've done some really amazing things with it, and he's had different developers involved, like S from formerly of Electron, now with Fours, did a bunch of DSP for him as well, and just the stuff that they can pull out of such a lightweight platform is really impressive.
That's
Dan, cool. What is the liability? Because I know, like Ken with the Hydrasynth, my impression is that is running on not quite bare metal, but it seems that the code is very efficient, low level, maybe even assembler running on custom silicon.
Yeah, it's assembly code that is done to their own DSP chip,
right?
That they manufacture in house. They have
that's my impression just from the UI and how it works. But Dan, I know you've had challenges with your network stack, with Bonjour and other things. So what kind of a liability is it that you're running on the compute platform, running on libraries that then may be out of your control?
So I mean, really the problems we've had are on our Windows, not to do with our own stacks. So this was, I mean, you're referring to, so I mean, the decision to use zero config, I think is good. In general, that hasn't been an issue even on Windows. It may be that we'll eventually shift things to use Windows native zero config. But that really has nothing to do with the networking of the unit. As far as connecting, this goes back to we were talking before about trying to make it as inexpensively as possible. So it has a single USB connection, and we wanted to be able to have a high bandwidth communication with it. So we chose networking, and first we chose RNDIS because we could get RNDIS for the Mac, and at the time that was what Microsoft seemed to be saying we should use, and then Microsoft stopped supporting it, and so then NCM came in, and we can do that.
I said Bonjour. I'm getting that mixed up with my Mio XL that uses Bonjour, which is a nightmare on the Windows implementation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not ideal.
It shouldn't. Bonjour itself is like this. It's almost nothing, right? It's zero configuration networking, and allows you to it allows devices to kind of declare themselves and send a name out, and so I'm surprised and sad that that's an issue for someone.
Yeah, I mean, this is outside of that scope, but it's something to do with Windows implementation of it, where I will power this thing up and I can't talk to any of the synths, and if I reboot the computer, now everything works. So it's something
they're not just mad at you and don't want to talk to you. Stop pissing your synths off.
It's something over time that happens within the drivers within Windows that it just doesn't like.
Yeah, I use Mio XL. I'm on Mac though, and I don't really ever have any issues with that thing. It is pretty quick and pretty nice. And alternatively, for pretty much similar usage, I have an MRCC, and I'm not sure what chip is in that, but it can't be very high powered because I can power that thing off a USB, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's great. But like for controlling MIDI data and stuff like that, you shouldn't really need anything insane
Nope.
anyway.
It's more the drivers to make the stuff all the devices on the Mio XL appear as MIDI ports within Windows. It's that driver layer.
As MIDI ports doing Bonjour, so because Bonjour is networking, right? So this
Yeah,
means
and it
network.
actually connects over the Ethernet to the Mio XL.
Oh, okay. So that's and it appears as a MIDI device.
Yep.
Hmm.
But there's a driver package you have to run in order to do that on the computer.
Well, NIST is MIDI over wireless, isn't it?
Well, no, probably do MIDI over wireless, but the Bonjour is networking, and so so I mean, like for USB, we appear as a USB class compliant MIDI device, and you just pop up, and that stuff all works. So, the networking that we use is for communication with the editor and librarian.
Yeah.
And if you need high bandwidth stuff, then that works better. But interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
It's super fast.
Mm-hmm.
With the editor and even just transferring, doing anything on your CM module synths is super fast.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
And what's cool with the Mio XL is because it's on my network, I could technically take a laptop upstairs and run Cubase on it over Wi-Fi and connect with synth down here. And
that's awesome.
See, I get on topics like this, and then I start looking around my studio, and I start wanting to just take everything apart and look at the processors in them. I'm like glancing over here. I'm like, what's inside of this?
Yeah, I've done it. I think I did that when I got the new Montage M, when I got the M7, and I opened it up just because I wanted to see what the new chips were in, and then to see, and I did a video of that, of just, hey, here's what's inside the Montage, and I identified the chips, and people just went nuts over that. I should do more of those videos.
Yeah, that's one of the things though, where it's like, okay, I recognize that I'm a useless nerd. Like, there's just stuff that this is not necessarily information that's gonna help anybody out, right?
Exactly.
Like, and for instance, I'll give you a for instance. I know of a synthesizer that has only analog outputs on it, right? Digital synthesizer, but has only analog outputs, right? So there is no SPDIF, there is none of that stuff. And the amount of time I get people asking about things of like you'll see like, well, what's the sample rate output and that sort of thing. It's like, well, none of that actually matters to you because you're only getting what comes out of the DAC, right? That's what's gonna end up mattering to you. Like, everything else doesn't actually matter. So, but it's the same thing. It's like, we just have this curiosity, and like, we're just nerds, and like, and especially being, people that are into synthesizers, got into synthesizers, generally speaking, not just because of the music, but because they have some other nerd proclivity to them, right? There's something else in there. My dad was a ham radio operator who worked at a Radio Shack. Like, that's pretty nerdy stuff, right? And, I love it. So I will open up computers and, gaming consoles, and synthesizers are no different. I open them up. Pedals are no different. I open them up. You want to see it. But how much
did your dad have a pocket protector?
There were periods where he did. Yeah. And he was also a marathon runner, so he had very short shorts at points too. And
my dad
is a proud nerd. And,
we come by all this naturally, though, because if you look back in the 70s, nobody could afford synthesizers. So it was popular electronics. Here's the kit you can buy and next month we'll be showing you how to do this board, and it was build your own. So it was guys with soldering irons who were the synthesis. And then once it started coming up and there was more and more companies doing it. Okay, so now that you're getting them pre-assembled, but you're doing patching with cables. And I mean, you have to understand the circuitry, and there is a circuit flow. There's a process, there's an audio flow, but you're actually hey, this is an LFO, it doesn't make a sound, but I'm using this electrical signal to control this, the control of this amplifier and this oscillator. So I mean, that's part of it, is that nerdy. It's not a guitar. You just don't strum it and sound comes out. There's lots of things you can do in the synthesizer that makes no sound at all, and you have to know why. So I think we've kind of come that way naturally.
Or you do a Heimbach where you use test equipment as synths. So
Yeah.
I once ran a poll on my channel asking people what's their background, and I think 80% of them said, I have a technical background, engineer, software developer, and they happen to have music as a hobby mostly.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that goes back to a lot of the times people not understanding the size of the market that we're in, because it's like that's a very niche group of people, right? But if that's all you surround yourself with, you think like, oh yeah, like everybody's into this stuff and this is, what I see all the time and blah blah blah. And it's like, man, I tell you, I started because I also work with Medeli, and they do arranger keyboards. And arranger keyboards are a completely different world. They look like synthesizers, they are formed like synthesizers, but they operate extremely differently and provide a very different customer, a very different experience to what something like a dedicated synthesizer does. And just wrapping my head around that workflow and starting to understand these sorts of things, you start realizing like, man, just what a narrow area we're in the vast world that we think we're in, right? So it's like you've got drum machines and groove machines and synthesizers, and you think like, oh, there's all these products, MIDI controllers, VSTs, there's all this stuff. It must be huge. But man, it is like a narrow segment of the music industry's equipment industry, which is like, it's like a subset of a subset of a subset,
And then of that synthesizer subset, we're going to make those arranger keyboards that applies to just this tiny subset, and they're going to be $5,000.
The Genos too. Yeah, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
Arrangers are big. Arrangers are
Yep.
big business.
Are they really?
Yeah, I mean, Ken was talking about like saxophones dwarfing us. I would say that from what I know, arrangers are significantly bigger than the professional synthesizer business.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed.
It's pretty eye opening, and it's a very worldwide business. Whereas in the U.S., for those of us that are U.S. based, we don't see them as much as I think a lot of our global friends see them. But it's also a very cultural thing where in different areas, I mean, it's very common where you may have one guy with an arranger in the backyard entertaining an entire party, and that's like a normal everyday thing. Whereas out here, it's like, well, who's got the Bluetooth speaker and blah blah blah. And it's like, well, they have an arranger keyboard with the Bluetooth speaker in it.
I see them a lot. My wife is a singer, and this is her professional singer. That's what she does for a living, and she stumbled into this market for singers that is nursing homes, because nursing homes by law have to have a budget, an entertainment budget that they have to spend. And so there is a whole group of musicians and entertainers whose entire full-time job is nursing homes, including my wife. So I've seen lots and lots of these musicians that play, and the arranger keyboards are very overrepresented in that group of people. You'll get one guy or two guy in there, and they just sit down with their arranger and they sit and they play and they sing.
Another quick point about this is something that I've noticed through the years of working with different musicians of different levels and whatnot. A lot of the times when I speak to very high level artists, right, very high level musicians, generally speaking, they have been practicing all their life. And that is where their dedication has been, like extreme on the practicing, right? Extreme on the dedication to the music. A lot of the synthesis go the opposite route, and they dedicate practice, but it's not to necessarily the playing, it's to the sound design, right? And it's to understanding the MIDI and all the doodads that go along with that, which is, in my opinion, it's every bit as valued, right? Like it's just two different pathways for people that use the similar product, but will use them in very different ways. There used to be a time where a synthesis was a regular part of a recording studio, a professional studio, and the artist would come in, tell them what kind of sound they wanted, and then the synthesis would make it. And now it's kind of gotten more blended, but at the same time, I can tell you, when I speak with extremely amazing artists that have amazing synthesizer collections, a lot of the times they don't know the synthesizer as well as I do, but I would never pretend to be able to play as well as they can, right? And it's kind of the same thing with the arranger stuff. A lot of the times I'll see arranger guys that will just shred. They are amazing on the keyboard. But if you start to articulate to them about what makes a sound good versus bad, or you get into all the connectivity and things, that's where things start definitely fraying and getting very, very different. So how, just to circle this back to, processors and that sort of thing, it's the importance of where sound is developed and how it's processed and what sort of processing power is used very much can be determined by the type of product you're creating and who you're creating it for.
A famous example is John Carpenter. Until Alan Howarth came along, he was just a really good player, but Howarth brought all the tech and the synth knowledge and is also a player. So when they collaborated, the stuff was phenomenal. So
you're 100% right. I know I have friends in industry who do a lot of film music scoring and production, and one in particular who comes to me and says, "Hey, can you make me these sounds?" And I mean, there are people. Dom Segalis is another one. Incredible player, but he has such a huge background in sound creation and scoring and so on. So there are some unicorns like that can do it all. But I think you're right. A lot of the people who I know who are working professional synthesists typically don't do a lot of sound design.
There are other things too, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the thing I wanted to ask. Do you feel a sense of pride when you turn on the radio and there's that one cork patch from that synthesizer from the 1980s or 1990s? And oh yes, that was on the Cork Prophecy, for example. I know some songs which use that. And that must be great, I guess.
It's fun. It happened a lot with the Wave Station. So the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer soundtrack, for instance, about half of it was just a guy holding down one note on a stock patch.
I think it really matters. It depends on how complex the synth is, because nobody could program a DX7, so all you heard was DX7 presets everywhere. They all use the same lately bass and the same EP2, and everybody's using the same presets, so you heard it everywhere. The Wave Station was, it was tough. So and especially for creating new sounds. But there was great presets, so people use them. How many times have you heard Ski Jam?
Mm-hmm.
So
and I think there's another thing which I struggle with sometimes in making sounds also, which is that if you can have these sounds that are these incredible soundscapes, but you don't hear anything unless you hold down a note for 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. Or not that you don't hear anything, but you don't hear the entire sound. You don't hear the sound breathe and things. And that kind of works against someone who's actually a player, right? And so you may want different things depending on who you're designing things for, right? So, and anyway, our instruments do that. I'm sure yours do that too, Ken. So you have some sounds that you can just kind of close your eyes and, play and hold a chord, and it's like this amazing thing happens. And, you move a knob and something else amazing happens. And there's definitely place for that. And then there are, sounds where, if you've got Jordan playing them, then you've got a whole lot, sorry, Jordan Rudess, then you have a whole lot of notes happening. And, if something takes 10 seconds to happen, you're never going to hear it. And so I think that there are these different spaces for sound design also. And, there are beautiful artists who just make breathing big sound spaces, but you have to have slower melodic and harmonic movement, I think, to really let that happen.
I remember when I first got the Wave State and I sat down and I was just playing it, and there were so many of these slowly evolving patches, and especially some of the ones that had strings and things in them. And I ended up taking it upstairs and sitting on the couch with it with a set of headphones. And every once in a while, my wife's sitting there. I'm like, oh, you got to try this one. And then she's no player, but she could make good sounds out of it simply just by playing a chord and listening to it evolve and change things. And because that work is done, it kind of catapults the creativity, because you are no longer thinking about, what am I doing to make this not so static? Because it is moving already, and all you have to do is just kind of guide it in the direction you want to go.
Mhm.
I spent hours on the wave state when it came like that.
I'm glad. Yeah, that if you recall, for some reason a lot of us had a lot of spare time during that period of time after the wave state was released. But I think it was a lucky coincidence that it was a pandemic synthesizer.
I actually wanted to ask Dan, is there a significant amount, or at least was there a significant amount of inertia within Korg when things started to get more software based and heading toward a Pi based system or some other kind of thing versus building traditional circuits to do the synthesis and other stuff?
I don't think so. I mean, Korg is a relatively nimble company, and we've traditionally done a lot of things that were kind of out in left field. And, I think that was driven a lot by the founder, Kato-san, and supported by his son. And we're entering a new era now, so it'll be interesting to see where the company goes. But
so there's a lot of the old guard like saying, well, we should do more of the traditional stuff or do more of this stuff instead, or
no. I mean, you do have to sometimes argue about new things, whether it's something like the microKORG, which I was not part of, but I mean that was a kind of controversial thing at the time because it had the tiny little keyboard, and people were saying, "Who's ever going to buy that?" And 20 years later, people are still buying it.
Usually successfully.
And it's there are other things. I mean, but yeah, I mean, even the analog stuff. I mean, Totz's stuff isn't. Gosh, I have stories about this that I can't tell, which makes me very sad. But it's not entirely traditional analog stuff either. So I think I'm sure that people have noted that they have electronic tuning stuff going on inside them, and that was originally what they were using ARM chips for. In those was to do tuning, and that allowed them freedom in certain other respects. So yeah, I mean. There are often times that we have to, work hard to do the things that we either want to do or the things that are right to do. But I don't think it's necessarily about momentum.
Okay.
I know we were talking about latency, and you were saying with CPUs that there is always latency because you basically you have a string of instructions that are execute. And the idea is just to make it happen so fast that you don't identify it. Yeah. And obviously, with technology of 1980s MIDI, you could load it down. You could hear latency in MIDI for sure. But there's also then the temptation to, we have all this extra power. Let's add more stuff to it. And then that's going to eat up some of that potential power for your latency hardware. That said, I think I said it in the chat. I'm trying to remember what I've said and what I actually wrote in the chat. That when I started using the CM-based synths, I was amazed at what you were doing just on a Pi module without any apparent latency.
And it's not me, so I'll say I think our engineers are awesome.
Yeah. There's some efficient code running there.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean we've been doing that part of things for a while, and I guess the only thing I'll say is we do try to be pretty careful about audio quality as well. So we're not working to cut corners about that, but things run very tightly. We use a lot of vectorization and have for a long time. So and when you are controlling the horizontal and the vertical, you can be confident that some things are going to happen, and you can know where things need to talk to each other, and that becomes somewhat easier.
I mean, you have an excess of computing power. Mirage is a perfect example where if you started playing a lot of notes and getting a lot of polyphony, a lot of samples running, the display and user interface, well, the display was a 7-segment display, but you could see it actually slow down because you just got this processor that's just trying to hold it all together to get it to play.
The Oberheim sample player. I don't remember the name of it right now, but are you guys familiar with this?
The 5.25 floppy drive one.
Yeah, well, they had both. They had
Yeah.
3.5 and 5.25.
I saw that one. Yeah.
And they could load, I think it was E2 and S900 and Mirage samples. And they didn't. There was no editing. They all it was a sample player, and it was a neat idea. And it was before you had things to convert samples from one format to another. And when they were playing Mirage samples, Scott, the front panel flickered, just for that extra touch of veracity.
Well, even just going back to like controlling stuff, if you have like the old, not to harp on Oberheim because like that just kind of brought it back to my mind, but like Matrix 1000, right? I had done a mod to mine, the Tontech mod to mine, so that it gives priority in the coding to specific tasks, right? So you're not getting a more powerful processor, but it's the order in which things are being processed, right? So that you can sweep a filter and it be a little bit smoother as opposed to how it was prior to that. But I think it's really interesting how we're at a point now where, we have all this extra power, but we still, even with all this extra power, like audio is such a tricky beast in the way that we perceive it and the way that we play it and interact with it that, the order of operation and things is still extremely important with this stuff. I've been really kind of watching, and again, from a standpoint of somebody who doesn't know anything, but I've always been intrigued by the there's extremely powerful video cards out there, right? And there's been some newer applications that are using graphics cards for audio processing, but the way that graphics cards process information is very different from a CPU. And because of that, it brings up different problems, but it can also provide different solutions. So I've been kind of watching that space a little bit from afar, just like interested to see where it goes. Because you have, like, I've got a RTX 4080 over here that like cooks my studio just like my analog synthesizers do. And I'm like, man, if that thing, what would that be like if it was processing all my plugins? But it really hasn't seemed to. No, there are. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. There are some graphics card audio processing out there, some GPU audio companies, but I was kind of surprised when I didn't see it getting picked up as frequently and as often as I had expected over time. But a lot of that has to do with the way in which the order of operations and that's sort
what
of
it
thing.
Is. Because it's massively parallel and having to schedule all those things so that the right data is ready at the right time, and then reassembling that. It's a lot of work.
The one application, the first thing the GPU audio guys did, right, was I believe an impulse response reverb, which is a fantastic application for that. And because reverb, has it's okay if reverb has a little bit of intrinsic delay. And that's kind of that's maybe the killer app for that. But yeah, they're very specialized and they're not optimized for real time. Even though you would expect again that video should be doing that. It's not quite the same.
And way back at that Altiverb thing, it was pretty cool using the
vector processing is extremely useful. Yeah, I mean, so and that was how they named themselves after the vector processing of the G4, yeah, G3, Altivec, and the VEC is for vector processing, right? And so all of these things have vector processing right now, and we actually started off hard coding stuff for the vector processing on the Pentium, and that's very important. And you can approach it in different ways. And again, if you're playing a lot of voices that are the same, then or that have the same structure, then that's really useful. But you can do other things also, as long as one thing doesn't have to feed into the other. You can make cascading things where you can kind of have things going there. But different bands of EQ, for instance, are fairly suitable to vector processing. Again, I'm not an engineer, so just pay no attention to anything I say. But yeah, it's the GPU thing. We were interested in that and kind of seeing how it went. And they're still there, and they're taking their time to start up, and we'll have to see. One of the other things may be that what you really need is common languages that are efficient and low latency, and that may also be an issue for them. But don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Has anyone played with the GPU audio stuff?
I have not.
No.
I may be checking this out though, because I'm seeing now. Steve and Kosh both mentioned in the chat that GPU Audio did finally release their SDK,
Yeah.
which this is the company that I was kind of referring to, and
Uh-huh.
it's really interesting stuff. And I haven't had a chance to dabble with it, but I have a absurdly powerful graphics card over here, so I'm like, usually that computer is relegated to like basic testing of, when I have a user who's like, oh, I have a Windows PC and it's doing XYZ with your product, then I'll test it, or some beta software and stuff. But generally speaking, I play a lot of Call of Duty, if I'm being honest. So listen, we all need to blow off steam away from the music sometimes. So that's my guilty pleasure. But no, that's something that I want to look into, because I just find that sort of thing fascinating as far as how they can do these things. So it looks like, they got a neural amp modeler in here and a bunch of other stuff. So could be very interesting to see how it functions. And it says 1 millisecond latency regardless of channels and processes. So that could be very interesting. Don't expect to see a RTX 4080 sticking out the side of a Hydrosynth anytime soon. I can tell you that much.
Yeah,
You'll be seeing a lot of keyboard players getting like burns on their hands from. You think your processor's hot now?
On the other hand, you could process blockchains, right? When you're
exactly. Like you're getting. Listen, people aren't tipping in the club. You might as well just be farming it out some Bitcoin while you play. The faster notes you play, if you play like, some Rush or something, the quicker it starts solving algorithms.
The money card gets a whole new meaning by this.
Yeah, that's the last place that we need to be, is like, because musicians are already being taken over by AI anyway, so, might as well just implement their processors right into our gear, right? I think we will be seeing, with the increased processing power in the future, we will be seeing things like AI-assisted patch development, and not just. I mean, I know that there is one of the plants, not phase, either phase plant, Synplant. That's it. Yeah. I know that, which is really interesting, and I tell you, that's a whole other topic I can dive into, because I see the future of where that's heading, and it's copyright hell. So it's going to be really interesting when that stuff gets broken out into reproduction of full tracks via synthesis.
Yeah, the problem with that is you need an awfully large graph or a data set to learn from, and that's going to be pretty specific to individual synths.
We're at the very beginning of this, and it's not stopping. So,
although look at Spotify farming their own artists to make new artists with fake graphics and
exactly,
names.
And if you can split apart stems of music now and manipulate them.
But you say that AI has taken over already for musicians, but do AI really enjoy making music?
Well, my toaster loves it. Let me tell you.
I can tell you, AI is definitely taken over the drudge work for development. I don't do a whole lot of coding, actual hands-on coding anymore, but I do work with and supervise quite a lot of people who do, and they use AI for code generation all the time. They'll say, "Oh, give me this," and it'll spit out 100 lines of code, and they don't just take it and cut and paste. They'll go through and say, okay, well, this is right, but this is wrong, but it saves so much time, and it's revolutionized code development, and it's only going to get bigger and bigger for that.
Yeah, I have a friend who's his day job, I mean, he's literally having to code his replacement that is AI.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like just think about that. It's like it's crazy. It's like, yeah. But anyway, I don't want to go down that pathway too
Yeah,
far.
just be careful what you
It's
wish for, right? You not want help, you're gonna get so much help, you're gone. So
Uh, I don't even know if it's necessarily wish for. I'm one of those people who's like, once the genie's out the bottle, you're not getting it back in kind of guy.
No.
Now, how laws evolve and all that, I also am a pessimist because I've seen what the courts have done with sampling and how wrong they've gotten it over times.
Mhm.
So there's been some good rulings recently. I think the most recent ruling on AI was actually not bad. It was kind of spot on, but again, my point to that is more just that as processors get more powerful in these low level applications and in these more niche in this niche world, um, we're only going to see things get more and more powerful and more efficient. Hopefully, if people care about the planet, they will use efficient processors. But we're going to see more in-depth technologies that are currently living in powerful computers migrating their way into handheld products, and so this is kind of long-term stuff here, but eventually you're going to see that kind of thing. You're going to see things that you could only do within an M4 processor right now in an iPad will eventually be done at a cost-effective way for the average musician.
Sure. I think the question with AI is how suitable it's going to be to specific tasks. And I absolutely agree with you, Scott, that AI driven, or I mean, like, I don't know, LLM or something less than that, pattern matching, uh, is already useful for sound design. So I mean, and we actually, I mean, as you were saying, the data set is the issue, right? And I think that one of the things that I think will stymie people is that there isn't a great data set for solo instruments, which is why the stems that are generated are, as far as I can tell, generally generated by the same method that you would use to separate stems from audio, as opposed to just play me the bass from that track, because it doesn't know what the bass is, has no idea what the bass is. The only way it would know it is you could say, well, it's things at this frequency, but you could try to define it, which is what the stem separation does, and it works. It's a dog walking on its hind legs right now, in my opinion, having listened to many audio examples. It's cool, and I think you can use it in certain circumstances, but to me it doesn't sound that great. And I don't mean anything offensive, and certainly nothing tortious towards anyone who's creating these products. But what we do this thing. So you were talking about SynPlant, which is really neat, and I played with that a little bit. And I use Microtronic a lot, actually, and also God, what's that? They have some sort of brilliant little processor. Can't remember.
Talk about Permutate.
Exceptionally quirky. Yes, Permutate.
Permutate is one of my absolute favorites.
Isn't
And
that
people
fun?
ask me all the time, they're like, what's a VST that you wish you had in hardware? And I always point to that. I'm like, I want that as hardware. Like, it would be so amazing.
And they're modeling a piece of hardware, aren't they? So
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. It's like, yeah, and getting back to Commodore, it will actually run BASIC in it.
Oh, awesome. And so we do something which is essentially kind of it's a low budget LLM where we have access to the data set, right? So for the randomization in these little synths, what we do is to it's sort of as if you had a multi-track version of the Beatles randomizing the organ sounds. And for the benefit of Mr. Kite, if you know that story, they cut up the tape into equal lengths from a bunch of BBC library organ stuff, and then threw it up in the air and then just spliced it together randomly, right? And so we have individual envelope shapes and filter settings and LFO settings just from all of our factory sounds. And then we have all of the individual portions, because a lot of these things are kind of the database storage allows for individual lanes within a sequence, and then the sequence themselves, and then the programs and the effects, and so when you press randomize on one of these things, it kind of just takes a lot of stuff from all of these different places and puts them back together again. And it's actually, I mean, I really like randomization. And I was concerned with these synths that there's so many parameters that, you know, as you were saying, I was either Scott or Ken saying that, you know, if you know, there's so many ways of hooking up a modular synthesizer that make no sound at all, right? And with these, there would just be too many ways of making it so nothing made any sense. So you start with little snippets of things that make sense, and you combine all these things together, and often as not, they make some sense when you play them. It works really well, and I would say, although it works very well, with humility, I'll say it's pretty primitive. The idea is pretty primitive, and I think that's ripe for exploration. And really, I would say that, you know, it knows about as much of what it's doing as an LLM does. It just has a, you know, more constrained data set.
I'm glad you said that, because I was actually going to bring up the same thing, because it seems too good to be truly random. And
yeah, it's not.
And, oh, I mean, no shade against the Hydrosynth, which is one of my favorite synths of all time, but you can very often you hit random and you get nothing.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we provide like all those other things, because it is random. So, like, you know, if you want to do shift random, then you're pulling parameters from an area, or if you're setting a percentage of random per module, and that's kind of exactly what we're talking about here, is like the data set of things. Yeah. It's like we're in such an infancy right now. Where we are right now is like just cutting baby teeth into where we're about to be. And I think that the speed in which this whole area is going to develop, not just for audio, but for everything. Audio is, again, a niche of a niche of a niche, but it's all going to trickle into us as well. And we're going to, the changes that are going to happen to synthesizers in general and synthesis and how we operate is going to be pretty wild to watch. I have a daughter who's getting ready to go to college. She wants to be a character creator, right? An illustrator. And, you know, when I went to the art college with her, they were not happy at the questions I was asking, because I was asking them. I said, you know, I was asking them questions about technology, and I want to know about, one, are you teaching them about deliverables? Are you teaching them about AI? You know, and you bring up AI in an art school, and it's like you killed their cat in front of them. Like, everybody gets very upset. And I'm like, look,
it's theft.
I understand this stuff. I'm an artist as well. I understand it, but I also know at the bottom line, we live in a capitalist society where people will race to the bottom. And if you don't use the tools that are out there and understand them and navigate them, whether good or bad, like, you need to at least be able to navigate this world, you know, then you're going to be out of luck. You can't close your eyes and pretend like this stuff doesn't exist, because it exists and it's not going anywhere. So, but yeah, I think that there is responsible ways of using AI and processing power in general. And I believe Korg has signed the same document that ASM has signed. There's actually a group about I'm kicking myself for not having it in front of me, but essentially about ethical use of AI in music. And ASM definitely signed onto it. I know that for a fact, and quite a few other companies have. But there's basically, it's a pledge to use AI in an ethical way moving forward. I'd be surprised if Korg wasn't there. They probably are. So not to put you on the spot, Dan.
The montage.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of it at all. So
the montage, it uses it in their smart morph, which is a very targeted, constrained AI, but where it can take. It was originally just their FM engine, where you could take 4 different FM patches and it would identify common traits that work well for modulation between them, and allow you to then create a patch that allows you to modulate between those 4. And you can do it now with the ANX engine as well. But they're saying it's AI, and it could be. I think it's very, very constrained rules-based AI, but it does seem to come up with good sounds every time. It doesn't come up with you know, just horrible shrieking noise.
The Smart Morph thing is cool. One of my favorite things is actually from years ago. The Sound Tower editors had randomization where you had checkboxes, what parameters you wanted to be randomized, and what
Just
you
like the
didn't.
Hydrosynth.
Yeah, and then you have patch genetics. Once you have something you like, now you go down that path and inherit stuff and build like massive amounts of presets that you could quickly audition. And quite often they were amazing. Sometimes they were crap, but at least you had some way to guide you with some of the randomization. So
I'm trying to search my inbox for this AI thing, and I'm like, I don't know where it's at. But yes, I'll have to find that sheet and share it. It was one of those things that we had kind of like, we're like, do we want to talk about this publicly or not? But
Well, there's another use of it in the Juno X, or sorry, the Jupiter X, where they have it watching what you're playing and generating an accompaniment in terms of bass line or rhythm or so on. On if you start playing quickly, it's going to start picking up and playing along with it. And I remember the first time I played one of those, I'm like, this is uncanny at how it's following me and identifying what I'm trying to do with the music, and it just kind of like comes along for the ride. Again, don't know if it is AI or they're just calling it AI for its.
I will just say, and this is one of the things about this stuff where it's like how it gets implemented needs to really work to not be in the way and to make our lives easier. This is I use plenty of Roland products. I'm not shaming them, but I have a Jupiter XM, and that arpeggiator makes me want to just like run my head into a wall when I'm trying to just do the basic stuff, like get out of my way.
Yeah.
You actually, it's kind of weird because it's sort of user error, but also sort of just like the way like it's the mindset of how it was implemented. So it's like you kind of have to go all the way to the end to get to the basic stuff, but all the complex, interesting stuff is up front. And I personally would prefer it to be the other way around. I want basic stuff up front, and
it's
then
very Rolandish.
Yes, it's very Roland. They have their method of doing things. And, like man, Roland does some amazing products, and some of the way that they go about things. It's each company has their own weird characteristics of how they do things. Like Yamaha and their menu system is one way, and Roland and their what do you call it? What is in ACB or not ACB, but Zencore and their other stuff. They use the
BMC. Well, the Zencore.
ACB but they have like each oscillator is basically like a quarter of a synth and that kind of thing.
Right.
What do they call that? I forget what they call it. But anyway, that whole architecture is always a fun navigation for me. I say that with a.
Speaking of arpeggiators, you mentioned Emacs earlier, and that had one of the best complex arpeggiators I had ever used.
Yeah, I don't know that I use it very much. The arpeggiator on it. I'm always sequencing my Emacs from other things.
It's fun to use just as a standalone. It's so cool.
Yeah. I'm always sequencing that kind of stuff from other things, and it's these older products that use MIDI. Thank goodness, because some of them programming sequences on them, like I've got a SQ80, and programming that thing is like it breaks my brain a little bit. But
you don't like that? It's supposed to be very easy to use. I enjoy that.
It is, but then when you want to edit things and do changes,
for that
stuff, kind of stuff, sure. that just kind of drives.
No, it's designed to be played in a certain way, and if you didn't do it, you got to try to do it over again. I think.
Speaking of, grab this.
It's like a fancy scratch pad sequencer.
Oh, I 3D printed the stand too damn good. I've been 3D printing a lot of my own stands lately, so I print them in a way that they like hold onto my gear at specific angles and stuff. But anyway, right there is the Oxy One, and it's like yay big and just does 48 channels of MIDI sequencing and CV and all that stuff, and it's just amazing. And it can be Bluetooth and battery powered, and it's like that kind of processing. Just like 10 years ago, it's like you weren't seeing that kind of stuff, and it's thin. It's like almost. It's like, I think it's 1.4.
Do you know what the core of the Oxy One is?
Huh?
What the core is? What processor has it?
I don't know, but it's it's
They look nice.
you know
Yeah.
for what it's doing, it's great, man. Like I've really been enjoying that sort of stuff. And you can have 4 different sequencers running at once. Each can be 8 tracks, and do some wild stuff with it, and do like generative things and all kinds of wackiness. But yeah, like that thing, and it can be like 4 or 5 hours on a inbuilt battery in it, or power it from USB. It's like super super efficient processors doing this stuff. Love it.
I have to ask you, Ken. Is it you who have a dog under the table? That sounds like an old telex.
My dog is sleeping. She's behind me right now.
Yeah, sometimes there comes a sound that sounds like an old telex.
Oh, I don't think that's her. I don't know. You've been pretty quiet, right? Come here. You say hi. Come on.
I did hear a background sound when it got quiet. There was some background noise.
Maybe. Could be. Could be. It could also be, oh, now she gave me the lovin's. It could also be just me touching my my boom here, because it'll make weird funky noises anytime I touch it.
Is that a border collie?
Yes, it is.
Nice. Those are really smart dogs.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Lovely
She's
dog.
a good girl.
One of my former coworkers at the zoo that I worked at, she does canine rescue. She actually went to Oklahoma City and used her dogs to sniff out people who were buried in the rubble and stuff.
Oh wow.
Yeah, very smart dogs.
You are. You sweetheart.
Well, it is lovely talking with you guys, and I have to go. Unfortunately.
Same
Yeah,
here.
I do
think
as
it's
well,
probably a
actually.
Good point to end.
Yeah. It has been a good show, and it's about the time where we ended, so it's fine. So it has been good having all of you. It's very professional talk. I could just lean back and go to the toilet and all that.
Turn off the mic first.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
So thank you for coming. It's been a good show. And perhaps we should make a show with the topic where we dissect Flux's studio, open everything up.
Yeah, I've done that all too many times, unfortunately. If you look through my YouTube channel, going back to like 2009, that's like a lot of my early videos are me just like cracking open gear and like looking at them and just being like, "Ooh, what's this? Zap!"
Just don't take apart a D50. It's a city of stacked boards. It's a nightmare. So.
Okay, but thank you all for coming, and thank you to the chatters. It was nice having you. We will be back again in 3 weeks' time, and in the meantime, I will do some noise shows. I have a few things to show, so it will come. I haven't planned when. So thank you for coming. Remember to click like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. And if you want to click dislikes, then do it twice. Then you get double.
Lovely talking to everybody.
Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Good hanging out. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for
Bye
having
bye.
me.
Thanks, everyone.